Hello everyone and welcome to NOUS. I'm your host Ilan Goodman, and this episode was recorded at the STS department in UCL in London. Thanks to them for hosting me once more. You can check the link in the show notes to find out more about the undergraduate and postgraduate courses they offer. Don't forget, you can follow me on Twitter at NSThePodcast, and if you're an iTunes user and you like the show, then why not leave us a good review? That would be much appreciated. Go on, do it. Do it now. Enjoy. Men and women are different. Men are bigger, more competitive, and better at spatial navigation. Women are more empathic, more emotionally and verbally fluent. And these differences all flow inevitably from our different biology. From chromosomes, from hormones, we end up with different bodies and different brains. That's obvious, right? Well, not so fast. According to my guest in this episode, the evidence of differences between the brains of men and women has been wildly overstated. What's more, any differences we do find might be better explained as the effect of culture, not biology. Gina Rippon is the Professor of Cognitive Neuroimaging at Aston University in Birmingham, and her new book, The Gendered Brain, sets out to shatter the myth of the male and the female brain. Professor Gina Rippon, welcome to NOUS.
Thank you very much.
So you've been on quite a publicity whirlwind this week with the book. I know you've arrived having done 3 interviews already today.
Indeed.
You've been on the radio, you've been on the television, you've got the cover article in the New Scientist, and you've had a flurry of really great reviews. But it's not proved uncontroversial. Before we get stuck into considering some of the objections and some of the praise and some of the criticisms, can you just take some time to lay out the structure of the argument in your book? Take us through the main ideas that you're arguing for.
Okay. Well, I think I make the point fairly early on that this is a pretty old issue. The question, are men's and women's brains different, has been posed for hundreds of years. Didn't actually used to be a question. It used to be a statement. Men's and women's brains are different. And the scientists at the time, even though they didn't have direct access to brains, were more than happy to invent different sorts of measures which effectively proved that women's social, political, financial, educational inferiority was related to their inferior brains. The reason I wrote the book was because various 21st century breakthroughs in our understanding of the brain and how our brains interact with our worlds made it clear that this was a question that needed revisiting, because I thought people should be made aware of how much more powerful or how much more influential the world is in how our brains are shaped than we'd ever realised. And if the influences in that world include gender stereotypes, then that is something we need to revisit. So the claims that men's and women's brains are different, the huge amounts of efforts that has been put into it by the neuroscience community down the years, but also the very important implications of the findings. I thought we needed to revisit those in terms of how we understand those differences. So effectively, the book is about sex differences in the brain, but the question is, are there any? What do they mean? That's another important statement to investigate. And what do they mean for the owners of those brains? So where do the differences come from, and how does that affect the brain's owners? I looked at what I felt was a hugely gendered environment, gendering having become much more powerful in the 21st century in terms of marketing expectations. So I had a careful look at those to say, look, these influences are very powerful. They're out there. They can be described. They can be documented. What evidence is there that they may change the brain? Because as a neuroscientist, that was the core of my argument. We're looking at what changes the brain. We're not looking anymore at a nature versus nurture, which I think is a very old and past its sell-by-date dichotomy. We're looking at how nature and nurture are inextricably entangled. And when we're looking at a really important issue like sex differences in the brain, we need to revisit that. So I looked at how early we might be able to find where these influences were affecting the brain. So I looked at, there's big section on very tiny babies and what we now know about how social they are. I call them tiny social sponges. Their brains eager to collect the right kind of information to make sure those babies are appropriately embedded in the right social networks, because that is the secret of the survival of a baby. Human babies are dependent and helpless for a very long time, longer than almost any other species. And so they need a very good survival mechanism. And their survival mechanism is learning the social scripts that the world presents them with. I was also interested in how those social scripts might affect people's behaviour. So there's a lovely phrase from Reshma Saujani, the founder of Girls Who Code: "We raise our boys to be brave and our girls to be perfect." And I think that really sums up the kind of differential social pressures that children are exposed to, and different expectations we have of our children, but also of ourselves. And I think that impacts a lot on adult decision-making and behaviour. So there was a kind of social psychology stream as well. And revisiting the ideas that neuroscience has come up with about how flexible and plastic our brains are throughout our lives. So it's not just as though, plastic in terms of brains being mouldable, responding to the environment. We used to think that was something which was important in the very early years when we knew the baby brain was growing and developing. But now we know that these kind of changes can take place throughout everybody's lives. So all of the influences that they encounter will continue to change their brains. It's not as though their brains have arrived at a developmental endpoint at age 10 or something. The brains will change. The brains will process information differently. We will make different decisions based on how we see the world. And that, I think, informs the differences we see in the world. There are gender gaps. There are gender gaps in mental health problems. There are gender gaps in engagement with science, which need explaining. And part of the gendered brains agenda is to try and explain that and say, we can be much more of an agent in how our brains develop. Now we know how much power how we live our lives has on the end product of our brain.
Good. Okay, so the structure and nature of the brain we end up with is all about the life the brain's lived. I think you say something like that.
Yes, the phrase I use, brains reflect the lives they've lived, not just the sex of their owners. Yes. And I put just in because sometimes people don't hear the just, because they think I'm a sex difference denier. They think I'm somebody who says there are absolutely no sex differences. It's all society. But that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that, yes, sex and biological, or sex or gender and biological aspects of sex, of course, have a major, powerful influence. But it's not always biology in the driving seat. Sometimes biology is being driven.
Yes, okay, that's nice. Biology is sometimes being driven. That's a really helpful idea. So one of the things that I've found in exploring various online forums and seeing how people are responding to your ideas is that there is quite a lot of information out there that people think they know, and that's become kind of common sense about what the differences are between men and women and how that must be to do with the brain. Mm-hmm. Can we just sort of go through some of the most popular ideas that people have about brain differences between men and women, and then we can talk about why you think either the differences are smaller than we think, or maybe they don't exist. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the most popular ideas about the differences?
I think the most popular idea is this idea about spatial cognition, the classic men are map readers story. That's a popular mantra in popular science circles or neuro self-help books. But I think it encapsulates every level of argument, because people believe that spatial skills that we have are based on how our brain interacts with the world and understands the relationship of one object to another in that world. And I think that's absolutely right. And it is a brain-based process. But the feeling is that women are poor at this, and there's a huge body of data which for a very long time has been looking at different sorts of tasks, mentally manipulating 2D representations of 3D objects and saying, is this abstract object the same as this one if you turned it through 90 degrees, and showing that women on average, and that's very important, perform more poorly on those kind of tasks. So there's a way of asking the question about spatial cognition, which mental rotation as a task encapsulates quite nicely. There's also a belief that hormones are key in this, and it's a test used to demonstrate the effect of prenatal testosterone, for example, on behaviour. But it's also a really good case study of methodology, some methodological inequalities, inaccuracies. I'm not saying they're necessarily wrong, but different ways of asking the same question. So you can find spatial tasks, paper folding, for example, which women are as good at or better than men. But again, when we look at this idea of differences, now we have huge bodies of data on those particular tasks. We can look at them, do a meta-analysis, a meta-synthesis even of those kind of studies, and see that the differences are tiny, change from study to study, seem to be changing over time, seem to change as a function of occupational level. And if you look at the way in which the data overlap, knowing that somebody is male or female is pretty meaningless in predicting how they will behave spatially or how good they are spatially. There are certainly different ways you can look at brain activation differences when people are doing tasks. You may find male-female differences. Again, they're tiny. Other studies haven't found male-female differences. So there's no consistent finding which says, yes, this is the part of the brain which is key to the skill, and yes, it's different between male and female. So that's quite an important definitive statement, I think I can say. But it's not what people believe.
So there are, I think, two really key points that I just want to draw out, which is that throughout the book, you're looking at the evidence of purported brain differences. And very often your argument is a critique of that evidence. So there are methodological flaws, or the effect sizes are really small, so actually the differences are tiny, or they disappear when you scale for size, for example. So there's all those methodological critiques that you're making through the book. And the argument there is the evidence for actual brain differences isn't that great, but there are differences. There may be differences, and it's important to say that you are okay with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, otherwise I've been wasting a lot of my career.
Yes. So
looking at brains.
Once they've come through all those methodological criticisms, some differences do remain potentially.
Yep.
Then the question becomes why?
And where do they come from?
Yes. And then that's where your argument about plasticity comes in. Yeah. Is it culture in the driving seat, driving the biology, or is it the biology driving the development of the brain in some inevitable way?
To extend what I was saying, I think that's a really good summary. And I think the other thing to point out is that, again, a methodological issue, if you look at studies where sex differences in spatial cognition are claimed, there's a recent study where they reanalyzed the data looking at video game experience and found that was a much better predictor of spatial cognition. So women with the same level of video game experience were doing just as well as the men.
So it's playing the video games that
it's
has
playing
made
the video
men.
games, which, if you do it often enough, it's a complex, can be a complex spatial task. And I think that's a really nice example of what looks like a biological difference. You take people that you believe are differentiated, male and female, and then you actually say, well, let's not take that as our primary independent variable. Let's look at something else. What kind of experiences have they had? What sports do they play, etc.? And that turns out to be a much better predictor. So that's why I think the kind of spatial cognition argument is a nice case study of what I'm talking about.
And one of the themes that comes up again and again in the book is the way when a study reports some difference between men and women, the media love it. They just love it. They jump on it. It's really digestible,
At last,
fun.
the truth. Yes.
But of course, all of the studies that report no difference, or the meta-analyses where the differences are reduced, they don't get reported. No. So I'm trying to sort of answer I'm wondering why people feel it's like absolute common sense, because I think people feel sometimes quite personally affronted, but that this is some sort of ideological PC nonsense, that it's just totally apparent that men and women are different and that their brains must be different. And I think part of why people feel that it's just common sense is probably to do with this phenomenon of sort of media hype, or how digestible and enjoyable sometimes these articles are. And when a study has found those differences, they very, very often just make a huge sort of deal of it in the press. Do you think that's right?
I think that's absolutely what's happened. And certainly in the height of what I call the kind of neurotrash years, there were so many articles of the at last the truth, men's and women's brains are wired differently kind, that it, of course, then informed the culture, the beliefs that people had. And what was interesting is those kind of, there was a nice study done at UCL, in fact, where they actually tracked the consequence, the beliefs that exposure to a particular kind of newspaper article had on what we call gender essentialism, the belief that biology is destiny and that men and women are different because their biologies are different. And those kind of articles really reinforced that belief. And people were much more likely to espouse the associated beliefs that actually, diversity wasn't a good thing, and men and women are different and should be treated differently, etc. So I think that was part of it. But I think also it's confirmation bias. I mean, people live their lives noticing or according to the fact that men and women are different. So they get quite affronted when a scientist comes along and says, actually, they're not that different. And if you then say, well, look, everybody's different from everybody else, but you're actually interpreting those differences in terms of a pre-existing label, which is actually not that informative and quite often inaccurate. And the downstream of what I'm saying is that sometimes harmful, because if you have a particular stereotype belief about people's skills based on their biology, which means you can't change it, in inverted commas, then that has negative consequences for that particular group of people.
So after all of the sort of critical consideration of the evidence that's out there, what do you think remains in terms of genuine brain differences between men and women? Are there any we can point to that, of course, still need to be explained as to why or how they arise? But what are they?
That's a great question. And as a neuroscientist, you think, I really shouldn't say I think that's actually an unanswerable question, because big surveys being done recently now, we have access to lots of brain imaging studies, because as you can imagine, in early days, we've got very small numbers of participants. Now we've got the opportunity to have more participants. The data are being shared. So we have, we can have databases including 1,000 different brains. But we have to remember that given that brains reflect the lives they've lived, all we neuroscientists are doing is getting a snapshot of what that person's brain is like when they're in the lab doing the task. And they may have arrived at the lab having had a fantastic holiday for 3 weeks doing nothing, or they may just have gone and done an Ironman marathon or something. I think it's unanswerable in that what we're looking at is constantly changing. Putting that to one side, the data that we're looking at suggests there is no one clear-cut finding which would enable you, a bit like those police procedures, where they find a skeleton and, the pathologist picks up a bit of pelvis and says, oh, that was a 35-year-old man or something. There is no one structure in the brain, in the human brain, that we can point to and say that structure is always different in men than women.
But what about differences on average? So I think most people accept that there's a distribution and men and women overlap hugely on that distribution. But on average, there are some differences between either the size of different parts of men's and women's brains or patterns of connectivity in the brain. In that case, do you think there are any robust differences?
Well, given the power I attribute to the world's influence on the brain, I'm always surprised that we don't find more differences, because we are living in such a gendered world that you'd think, even if we attributed those to what's going on, you think there must be some differences given how differently people live their lives. Most of the data we're looking at, the connectivity is very interesting, because that's a new way of looking at the brain, and something which people are revisiting these old questions, saying, oh, well, maybe it's not structures. Because we should say that the link between the structures we find in the brain and the behaviour we're interested in is not as clear-cut as neuroscientists may convey. So we don't actually know whether the size of the amygdala, what the relationship is between amygdala size and emotional perception, for example. You can make a pretty good guess. You can look at a correlation, but the link between structure and function is not as clear as people think. So finding differences in the brain doesn't necessarily translate directly into the behavioural differences, which we're trying to explain.
Yeah, and actually, just to pick up one point about the relationship between structure and function, and by structure, we're really talking about the size of different bits of the brain,
size
right?
of different bits of the brain, and now the strength of the connections between them. I think there is another, the human connectome they're talking about. So we're not, because the structure, different structures, a bit. It used to be called neophrenology. It's a bit like saying there's different bits of the brain and that bit's bigger, so you must be better at X, or that bit's smaller, so you're not very good at Y. That brain doesn't work that way. And sometimes people say, well, let's have a look at the patterns of activation, But we now know, for example, as you learn a task, as you start the task, bigger patterns of activation in particular parts of the brain, as you become more proficient and an expert, then the areas of the brain that activated change and may actually be smaller. So the kind of size matters agenda, which figures on this whole story really, is something which needs to be challenged.
Now, you've avoided saying any specific differences so far, so I'm just going to throw a couple of particular points at you. So men have bigger brains than women.
Yep. On average.
On average. Okay, so there's again distribution which overlaps. It's always worth saying that doesn't tell you about an individual. You can't look at an individual brain on the basis of size and say that's male or female. You just can't do that. But on average, men have larger brains. Not surprising, because they have larger bodies as well.
And hearts, livers, kidneys. Yep.
Now, there is also a fairly weak correlation within sexes between brain size or brain volume and intelligence. Yes? No?
I'm looking skeptical.
Yes? Okay.
Yep. I
understood there was about a 0.4 correlation, which is, I think, fairly low within men and within women, which interestingly doesn't translate across the sexes. So there's no difference on average between men and women.
I think, and again, it possibly sounds like methodological sour grapes. What do you mean by intelligence, and how is it measured? And the early studies, which did look at grey matter volume in men and said, there's many more parts of the brain, grey matter parts of the brain correlated with IQ in men, and therefore they're much more intelligent. And that's still around. I mean, there are still authors who I perhaps won't name who still believe that men are more intelligent, because this is a key finding. I think the intelligence issue, and it's not just a kind of sour grapes thing. I think that's really important. What do we mean by intelligence, and how is it assessed? And I think that's part of the methodology that I also challenge in the book. How are we asking questions about behaviour? When Janet Hyde has done an amazing set of meta-analyses on well-known, in inverted commas, male-female psychological differences, personality characteristics, skills, etc. And in fact, the meta-analyses that she and other people have done have now been subjected to a meta-synthesis, which is actually the next higher stage, when let's have a look at the outcomes of these meta-analyses. What story is that telling us? And that's about behaviour. And the conclusion is that men and women are much more similar than they are different. So if you think of the chain of argument, which I mentioned right at the beginning, status quo, men and women are different, they behave differently, therefore we need to find the differences in the brain. Actually, we need to go back to that status quo and say, how true is that? If men and women are really more similar than they are different, then maybe we're on a fool's errand trying to find the differences in their brains.
Okay, but just to go back to this point about intelligence, you sort of said, well, we have to be careful about what is it we're measuring. But surely IQ is a very well-validated measure of intelligence that seems to correlate with lots of other outcomes. It seems very robust and predictive. And it's one that, no?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. So what's your objection to the use of IQ?
Well, I think IQ tests, the old adage, IQ tests measure how good you are at doing IQ tests. I don't think they necessarily translate into I must be fair and say it depends what you mean by an IQ test and what are you actually testing. If they're a decent battery of tests, which tests, for example, perceptual skills, memory span, verbalness versus non-verbal ability, etc., and you look at each of those, then there are interesting relationships emerging. They are very small, but we are talking correlation and always talking correlation and not cause. You can't stimulate a bit of the brain and say that shows somebody gets a better score on an IQ test, although I have seen that claimed. So I think it's a lot of this is about argument, scientific argument and conclusions. But it's important to challenge that because the outcome of those arguments and conclusions will then feed in, as I say, feed into a possibly gendered world where the existing stereotypes are being sustained or reinforced as opposed to being challenged. So I think the IQ intelligence argument depends what you mean by that. And again, I think I'm not aware, I will go and have a look, see if there's a meta-analysis on those kind of findings. I'd be interested to know how robust they are and how well replicated.
I would have thought there would be. It'd be pretty easy to do. There's lots of IQ data around.
But not necessarily IQ data that's correlated with brain imaging data, which I thought that's what you were saying.
Brain size, yeah. Well, actually, the point I was trying to make with that was almost in support of what you were saying was that, okay, so on average, women's brains are smaller than men's,
yes,
but there is on average no difference in intelligence. And so that introduces exactly the point you were making, which is, well, what is the relationship between structure and function?
Anything.
Yeah, because if women's brains are on average smaller, but there is no on average difference in intelligence, then the relationship between structure and function isn't a straightforward one. You know, if it was bigger brains mean more intelligence, that would be straightforward and clear. We know what that...
Which, of course, is where we started with, you know, men are superior because they've got bigger brains. And then people said, well, actually sperm whales have got bigger brains than us, and elephants have got bigger brains than us. So it's not just a straightforward size matters issue. But
so there is no easy relationship between structure and function.
No.
So even if, for example, and you might contest this, but the amygdala is, well, what's one of the claims? The amygdala is bigger in women or men?
Bigger in men is one of the, well, interesting point, actually. If you track the history of that, it used to be the other way around. It used to be claimed to be bigger in women, and that's why they're emotionally superior. Then looking at, it was a recent meta-analysis done about 5 years ago now, looked as though amygdala was bigger in men. But the key thing to remember, and that this is where the size issue comes in, there was 2 studies done 2 years ago, by Lise Elliott and a team, meta-analysis of studies into the amygdala and the hippocampus. The key thing is a size issue. If you correct these measures of internal structures of the brain, if you correct for size, those differences disappear.
So can you just clarify what you mean by correct for size?
Well, it's if you've got an organ which has got all sorts of different structures in with connections between them, as that organ gets bigger, then you have what's called a scaling factor. So either the structures stay the same size, in which case the connections between them need to get bigger, or in order to maintain the relationship between the different structures get bigger to maintain the relationship. So effectively, it's an allometric issue that the change in size, which is related to the size of the body that is carting the brain around, does affect the structure, but just in terms of the configurations of structures within the brain, if you like. So we might just be looking at a scaling issue. And if you take that scaling issue into account and look at differences that have been found, and that's right from very early suggestions that the connection, the corpus callosum, the connection between the right and the left hemisphere was bigger in women, all of those have been found to disappear once you take that scaling factor into account. So all of the differences which have been claimed as differentiating men's brains from women's brains actually looks as though they're differentiating small brains from bigger brains.
And so it's the relative size within the brain structure as a whole that we're interested in.
Yep.
Okay.
And I would just say that there is, as ever, ongoing arguments about what you should be correcting for. So sometimes it's brain volume, Sometimes it's the whole brain volume. Sometimes it's just what they call the intracranial brain volume. Some people say you should also take height and body weight into account. And so in a way, it's almost getting back to the old kind of craniology type arguments where let's measure the angle between the earlobe and the tip of the nose or something. And you keep going until you find one that comes up with the answer you want.
So I want to talk about one particular theory, which you call the brain organization theory. So I should say that the brain organization theory, if I've got this right, is just the idea that as a fetus is developing in the womb, it's exposed to a particular profile of hormones, which has an effect on masculinizing or feminizing the brain, as those hormones have an effect on the biological, the genitalia that develops, and that has long-lasting effects. So that's my very simple sort of version of the brain organization theory, and that I found that was a theory that I had long found very plausible. It seemed to make sense. It's behind Simon Baron Cohen's ideas of the differences between male brains and female brains are largely down to this sort of cocktail of hormones that you're exposed to in the womb. And I think it's quite a widespread idea. It's one that you don't have any truck with or you think is basically wrong.
I certainly have truck with it because I think it's very important. I think it basically oversimplifies the story. I think it ignores the fact that the brain organization theory was acknowledging, that the exposure to fetal testosterone in males has obviously, usually, quite marked effects on the external genitalia, and that's what determines what gender you're assigned at birth, etc. The link to brain and behaviour was based completely, in a way that ethically, of course, on animal studies. So you could, castrate a male guinea pig and see what happened to their behaviour. You could inject different levels of hormones in developing fetuses. So all quite interventionist strategies on animals. At the end of which you then look to see, has that changed this animal's behaviour? And of course, the behaviour you were looking at was reproductive behaviour. Does a female rat that's been exposed to testosterone try and mount a male, for example, behave in the reproductive behaviour has been changed, and maternal care, etc. So lots and lots of data on that showing it being possible to show quite strong causal relationships. So that was the basis of the brain organization theory, that we alter hormones prenatally, so prior to any exposure to social factors, which, bearing in mind we're talking about rats and mice, is a moot point. But then we can therefore alter the behaviour of that guinea pig, mouse, rat, whatever. And therefore that proves that the brain has been changed. Would say that no very clear evidence of how the brain has been changed. Again, it was working backwards from the behaviour, but it was reproductive behaviour. And that's very clearly, there are very clear differences. And so a very decent body of data was collected.
And, it is reasonable to assume some degree of continuity between other animals and humans, right? That we can learn something useful from animal models, even if we can't generalise the findings straightforwardly.
Yes, we can generalise to some extent, but, and this I think is a core part of what I'm saying, one of the things that is different about human brains is the power of the external world, of the social rules in the external world, the drive to be social. And therefore, you are looking at both quantitatively and qualitatively different brain environment interactions in humans as opposed to mice, rats, bonobos, zebrafish, whatever. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. The other thing that we now know, again, in terms of sort of plasticity and how the brain will change in terms of the environment it finds itself in, that's also true of hormones. So we're now talking postnatally, obviously. We're talking about perhaps activational effects, so that puberty shows different hormonal levels. And that's an interesting point to bear in mind, because people will say that boys and girls become different very early on, from birth. But, their hormone levels are the same unless you're going to invoke the prenatal hormone levels. But boy and girl behaviour is quite different even before puberty. So the power of hormones in human children is is probably diminished. And I think that's important to bear in mind.
I got a little bit lost there. So are you saying that in young kids, boys and girls have similar levels of different kinds of hormones? But they show very different behaviours.
Yes.
So some people are going to say, well, that's the influence of prenatal hormones.
They will, and do.
And you're saying that's to do with the environment and society.
I'm saying that the two interact, actually. I mean, and that sounds like a get-out clause, but no, I think that's important. The hormones must be important because you can see the effects of unusual levels of hormones in humans. If you add exposure to inappropriate, in inverted commas, levels of hormones can result certainly in quite marked physical problems. And girls, for example, who've been exposed to high levels of testosterone, which to the level that they are born with ambiguous genitalia and therefore easily identified as having been exposed to the inappropriate levels of hormones, are followed up in detail, studied intensively. This girl has a female genotype but has been exposed to high levels of a male hormone. Has this changed her behaviour? Has it made her more masculinized? I'm afraid, as with all other studies, some say yes, some say no. There's no clear-cut answer. But of course, you're also looking at, there are medical problems associated with this, physical problems, which require continuous medical intervention, continuous medical treatment, etc. So these girls are not representative of other girls in saying the only thing different is this exposure to high levels of testosterone. There are other things which will have impacted on their lives. So that's a kind of methodological thing. But I think what I'm saying is that, to come back to the animal studies and human studies, I think it's too big a leap to say we can look at what's done in guinea pigs and say that is going to have exactly the same effect in humans. I don't think that's the case. It is the case that we know that society, we look at testosterone levels, for example, in men who are primary carers of their children, as opposed to men who are not. And we
I have to say, this is one that really struck me. I've got it written down here. Sorry to interrupt, but I'm excited you bring this one up because I read this. I thought it was just fascinating. It was just that testosterone levels in fathers will vary as a function of how much time they spend caring for their children.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's great. Yes. I mean, there's some nice experimental studies too. And that was the doll study, where they gave three different groups of men. They gave a group of men three different types of doll that they had to care for. One of was a doll that, whatever you did, carried on crying. One of them was a doll that responded but randomly. I think that's right. But one of them was a doll that, whatever you did, stopped crying and result kind of thing. And they showed that the testosterone levels of the men varied in that study, so that the men who satisfactorily, even though they didn't know it was manipulated, managed to calm the doll, the testosterone levels dropped. And we can unpick that study in detail. But I think what's interesting is that the environmental factor of successfully calming a child as opposed to not, that was reflected in hormone levels. So I think Cordelia Fine, in her book Testosterone Rex, makes a far better and more detailed analysis of this whole idea that testosterone is a primary driving, determining hormone, which makes men how they are, why they're business leaders, great warriors, etc. But if we look at the human, actually she challenges the animal data in a lot of detail, but if we look at the human data, it's clear that the hormones are just as responsive to the social environment as our brains are. And they may even be the mechanisms whereby those changes are brought about. So
it's the point you were making earlier that this is we often tend to see the causal direction as biology driving behaviour.
Yep.
But here it's sort of circumstances or behaviour driving the biology.
Yeah. Which makes us the flexible, wonderful individuals we are. So it shouldn't really be a surprise. But it is to a lot of people because they've got a fixed idea that biology is destiny.
So should we talk about the sort of Twitter spat that's been going on, which cropped up over a very positive review of your book that was written by Lisa Elliott in Nature.
Yep.
And there were a couple of different people responding to that on Twitter. So one of them was Stuart Ritchie, who is a researcher at Edinburgh, and he's just last year, I believe, was the lead author on a huge study of about 5,000 participants using brain imaging data and looking at differences between men and women in the brains. Yeah. Not saying why they were different, crucially, just looking at what the differences were, trying to sort of provide a basis of evidence. And then also Kevin Mitchell, who was a previous guest on this podcast and has a very different view on these issues than you. So can you tell us what's the sort of the Twitter spat about, or how are they taking issue with, at least because they haven't read your book yet. Unfortunately, they've read the review and there's quite a lot that they found to object to. What is it that they're picking up on?
I think one of the issues is the statement I made at the beginning is that the brains reflect lives they've lived, not just the sex of their owners. And they pounced on that. And said, of course, there are sex differences in the brain. And, this is just one of those swivel-eyed sexist difference deniers. So there was a lot of that. And because there is a lot of very good data out there, very nice brain imaging studies reporting differences. Stuart Ritchie's was one of them. And in fact, I looked at those data before he published.
Yes, I noticed actually you're in the thanks of that.
Yeah, that's right. Well,
because you gave feedback.
He put the data up on a pre-publication website so that people could look at it. I think the Stuart Ritchie data, two things. If you look at the effect size, and he publishes the effect size showing how these data overlap. The effect sizes are tiny. We're talking about half a standard deviation in some cases.
Okay.
So
what can you just kind of contextualise what that means?
It means, if coming back to the kind of two bell curves, if you plotted the data from males and females of amygdala size or hippocampal size or grey matter volume, you'd get the classic bell curve, but it's overlapping a lot.
So are we talking about overlapping by like 85% or something, or more?
Yeah, if that kind of size. I mean, we're certainly about 85% for some of them, and the key ones that were reported. Some of them more. The grey matter volume is, I think it's effect size of 0.9. I haven't got those figures at my fingertips. One thing that's not reported, although it is in the paper, that you couldn't actually take part in the biobank study until you're over 45. The average age of the brains that were being looked at was 60. So two things. First of all, they didn't draw attention to the fact that the average age of women was 60. And if we, as we are saying, say hormone levels can affect what we're looking at in the brain.
Right, yes.
You've got 60-year-old women. And this is the average age. So the youngest were 45 and the oldest were a lot older, obviously. But then you think, so 60 years of social living, education, particularly if you're 60, then probably the levels of education may differ between men and women, from when they were 10, 15. And I'm not just nitpicking in order to say I don't like the finding. I think it's an important finding, but it needs to be contextualised. But the point is, yes, there are good studies out there, or there are studies out there which report sex differences, but we need to bear the context in mind. And I think the Stuart Ritchie study is an example of that, and I think he would acknowledge that. But the straw man argument was that I'd said there are no sex differences in the brain, right. And I didn't say that. So I think that was part of the straw man argument.
Okay, so that's what the Twitter spat was all about, was it?
I think a lot of it was that. It was, and then of course you then get another straw man argument is a kind of political ideology. This person is talking about these data just in terms of feminism. I mean, in fact...
Yes, I mean, I definitely encountered this. So I waded into a couple of online scraps about your work there's a sort of discussion group about neuroscience on Facebook.
Oh, right.
And someone had posted a link to...
Don't do Facebook, so
a couple of... Well, it's got like 120,000 members, so it's,
Yeah.
And everyone knows a bit of neuroscience in
yes.
it. So it's...
Yeah.
So there's a fairly high quality of conversation, of discussion. But, there I definitely encountered this is just politically motivated pseudoscience. I did enjoy in your book, and you'll forgive me, I hope, for bringing this up, but you do mention being called something like postmenopausal
affirmative action loser,
which made me chuckle.
And full of carp. That was the other one.
Full of carp,
yeah.
Yes. No, so this idea that it's politically motivated, that it's PC nonsense, is quite a common response, isn't
absolutely.
it?
Yeah, yeah.
And I tried to sort of put the case to some of these people that actually you're doing the opposite. You're saying a lot of the evidence that we've drawn these conclusions about big differences from are themselves biased and distorted by political agenda or by sort of pre-existing attitudes. And in fact, quite a lot of what you're doing is quite a careful assessment of the evidence and going, well, actually, that's, there are some assumptions or there are some methodological problems that are problematic or that need to be examined here. I mean, it didn't go down very well.
No. But thank you. Yes, I mean, that is exactly what I'm trying to do. And in fact, because I work with Cordelia Fine and Daphne Joel and Becca Jordan-Young, and our aim is never to be sex difference deniers, but to say sex differences is so important, or an understanding of sex differences is so important. It's really important that the research is done well. And I think that message gets missed. They just assume that we are sex difference deniers and that it's sour grapes don't like that study because X, Y, and Z. But I think in a way it comes back to the video game experience thing. If you've got that fixed mindset and you analyse your data in terms of I am looking for differences between males and females, you probably miss really interesting alternative explanations, which might be much more valuable to know about. It might be really valuable to know that video game experience can affect your spatial skills because, well, let's introduce spatial training as in education. Let's make sure that everybody has that sort of experience.
And on the topic of you not being a sex difference denier and of actually advocating better quality research into sex differences, you did publish, I think with Daphne Joel, sort of suggestions of variables that need to be taken into account. And I think this feeds into the plasticity story. Can you tell us what are the variables that you think need to be factored into these studies that might make a difference to brains that are being ignored?
Yes, so in fact, it was with Cordelia Fine and Rebecca Jordan-Young as well. I think it's fairly simple, actually. It's additional demographics. It's education, years in education. It's occupation. Is your occupation likely to improve your video spatial skills or your empathy levels? Because that's what you do all day. And so education, occupation, social status, socioeconomic status, because that's been shown to be important. Possibly hobbies and sports enjoyed, because I think those are brain-changing. I mean, you could say anything that's brain-changing, at which point, a researcher would just throw up their hands in horror and say, there's no way we could do that. Although actually with much more complex approaches to analyses like Bayesian statistics, you could probably have a much more nuanced look at your data. And I think that would be great. But just very simply, I mean, these big data sets that are now available, fantastic for finding differences if you're looking for them. And there was a paper recently which came out, which looked at a huge data set and found sex differences, but didn't take years in education or occupation into account. And they have to be factored in because they do change the brain. We know they change the brain. And they may well intersect with sex differences, but you can't say this is a pure finding. There's a single variable. If you address it with a single variable, you're ignoring lots of information, perhaps.
Okay. A few things. Okay. So one of the arguments that, again, I found I had kind of some sympathy with, or at least the logic I found very persuasive, is the argument from evolution or from evolutionary psychology, which says, well, of course men and women, male brains and female brains must be different because the pressures driving the evolution of men and driving the evolution of women are different. So women have to have babies and men don't. And so they're competing and they're hunting and women are caring and raising the babies, right? So these are the pressures driving the evolution on the savannah over hundreds of thousands of years. And this is the sort of argument offered by Helena Cronin. Yes, who I know you've encountered before. She's a Darwinist philosopher based at the LSE, and she's very keen on this kind of evolutionary psychology stuff. And she's and I think evolutionary arguments are quite popular. I mean, they do lead to some slightly ridiculous theories. I particularly enjoyed reading about in your book about the idea that women prefer pink because they evolved as berry gatherers, while men were busy hunting.
Yes, and needing to scan the blue sky.
Yes, man needed to scan the sky, yes.
Whatever.
Anyway, back to evolution and evolutionary psychology.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I think for me and for many other people, I've always found that a very powerful argument. It seems very plausible. It seems very forceful. What do you say to it?
Well, evolutionary psychology in particular, you probably picked up, I find quite difficult to take seriously because they have a classic example of working backwards from what they see and finding an explanation. And the evolutionary terms are compelling, and men are captains of industry because they're the hunters and women are good at caring because they're the gatherers kind of argument. I like evidence. Being a scientist, I like evidence to support the arguments. I mean, I think referring back thousands and thousands of years to explain how our brains work today, given what we now know about how flexible our brains are. And in fact, the whole story of evolution is the fact that we were flexible and responded to the changing environment. The idea that, those kind of pressures are still driving brain responses today, I find hugely implausible. If you believe in evolution, you believe in biological flexibility. So I can't believe that we're still being driven around by caveman or cavewomen brains. So that's a kind of personal rant. I don't think we have the evidence. I don't think how we could get it, actually. I don't think the pressures... Well, but again, you see, of course, if you believe that, then, if you believe you're a captain of industry and competitive, that's what the world expects you to be and how the world treats you, that's what you'll get. So it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, but I don't find those arguments compelling.
Okay, good. So I want to put to you a few things just to finish up that are, I think perhaps they're difficult for your approach to explain, or that they need a new response given your argument. So one topic is this question of why some people are transgender. Okay, so you do touch on that in the book, but you deal with it fairly briefly, and you raise the question, if there is no such thing as a male or female brain, then where will our gender identity come from? So where will it come from? Because I don't think you really answer it in the book.
No, I touched on it very briefly, deliberately briefly, because I think it's such a complex issue that it needs to be treated in detail. I think the concept of gender identity, or any kind of identity, comes from, again, the fact that our brains are social. And one of the things, in order to be social, is we need a clear idea of ourselves, who we are, where we fit into the various social networks. So our self-identity, independent of gender or any other kind of beliefs, I think is a brain process. But it's a brain process in interaction with the social world in which the brain finds itself. I think the statement that a lot of transgender people make is that they were born into the wrong box. They've got a female brain in a male body, or vice versa. I think the reason they object to what I say is because I say, actually, I don't think there's any such thing as a female brain. I think there's a brain which responds to the pressures around us. If they're gendered, then you will get a gendered brain, which is why the book is called what it is. But of course, it undermines a key argument they have, which is the next stage, particularly for that group, is that they feel that there's a mismatch between their brains and their bodies. Therefore, they want their bodies changed. And this is an argument they espouse in favour of very severe medical interventions for adults, but also, I find more worryingly, to be honest, for children. So I'm just challenging the logic of that argument. And my feeling is that the basis is characteristic of the whole male-female argument. Maybe we should just challenge the idea of boxes. We're so fixated on the binary importance of are you male or are you female, which, of course, are the labels that go on the boxes, that actually we should be challenging the boxes rather than saying I want to go in that box. Just say I don't belong in any box. I am who I am. I've got this particular portfolio of skills and abilities and preferences, and this is me. And trying to stick a male or a female label on it, I think that's the problem. And I think that's the problem that we should be looking at, rather than trying to fiddle around with people's bodies.
Okay. That sounds explosively controversial. I'm not sure I can quite quite grasp what it is you're arguing there, because we're not going to let go of male and female binaries entirely, are we?
I think when people say to me, so what's the solution? Is it gender neutral parenting or something? Which I think Harry and Meghan have just announced they're going to do.
Oh, have they?
Which will be interesting. I think it's gender irrelevance. I do think we need to get away from the importance that is attached to being male or female. I mean, the argument with Simon Baron Cohen is he calls the brains male and female, but then says you don't have to be a man to have a male brain, which makes me challenge, as you know, the label. But I think actually what's wrong with calling a brain empathizing or systemizing? And if you've got an empathizing brain, then, you know, this is how you will behave and respond to other people, etc. Much more informative. And you know, challenge, why do we have to put somebody's sex on their birth certificate?
I see. So it doesn't matter. So first of all, there's no binary kind of brain. That's your the first point of your argument.
Yes.
There's no two different kinds of brains, and therefore your genitals don't have to match a kind of brain because there is no such thing to match.
That argument works both ways, because I think the original argument is not that your genitals determine your brain, but the biological force which determined your genitals also determined your brain. And I don't think that's the case. And so breaking that link, I think, is important. But also I think that we don't have binary brains. I mean, Daphne Joel's work on the mosaic brain shows that you take over 1,000 different brains and no one is the same as any other brain. And more recent work showing that if you type brain structures or collections of brain structures, they don't come up into types onto which you can neatly stick either male or female. So actually getting rid of those, you know, labels altogether would be a good thing. I think it would reflect what science is telling us.
Okay. I imagine some transgender people might find that quite hard to digest. I mean, if you feel like a woman in a man's body and then you've undergone surgery, your message is quite hard to. It's not very palatable, is it?
Well, but I think there is a separate issue. I think the transgender and gender dysphoria issues get conflated. Right. So gender dysphoria is a feeling of really intense distress that the genitals, you know, the physical characteristics of the body you're in, you find, just trying to think of appropriate phrase, distasteful, distressing. I think that's a separate issue from quite a lot of the trans issues, which are just about identity, not necessarily about the body that your identity is associated with. But I think if hopefully the nuances of my message get through, it's actually a much gentler way of dealing with this issue. And you can be whatever you want to be. And if the labels are taken away, then to some extent that solves the problem.
I want to just talk about the gender equality paradox, right. Because that's really interesting. And so that's this phenomenon whereby countries where by certain measures the level of gender equality is rated the highest show actually the largest gender gaps in, for example, the proportion of men studying STEM subjects versus the number of women, or the proportion of women studying STEM subjects. So in your book, you report that in the UK, it's around 30% of students enrolled in STEM degrees were women. I think that's 2012 to 2015. And in the US, it's around 25%. But in countries where Scandinavian countries like Finland, Norway, and Sweden, the rate is actually lower of women doing STEM subjects, in 20%. But those are the countries where gender equality is rated highest. Now, the Jordan Peterson explanation for that phenomenon is that when free to choose, women prefer certain kinds of things because of biology and because of evolution, and men prefer certain kinds of things. So it's biological destiny playing out.
Yes.
that's not your explanation. What's your take on that problem?
I think I'm really interested in that because the whole issue of representation or underrepresentation of women in science is a campaign that I've been part of for some time. And I think that the message in the underlying narrative is really interesting. The assumption is that when it says free to choose, I mean, and the argument is that in the higher gender equality countries, the financial pressures to go into a science career which pays better are less. And so the higher representation of women in countries like India, for example, a reflection of financial pressures. If those are, and I don't know if women in Scandinavia might challenge that, if those are less in Scandinavia and you are free to choose, you then have to look at what's being chosen. And I think long chapter on the fact that science is still viewed as a male domain. Scientists are still expected to be men. And, they've tracked that over long periods of time. You then think, okay, free to choose, but what is it you're choosing? Remembering you're a social being, you want to fit in, you want to belong, you want to be part of a network. You look at a choice point where there are no role models for you. The representation as you go higher up the scale, many more men than women, if we're going to talk in gender terms. Even things like, recent Google memo and CERN physicists saying that women can't do science because they haven't got the right sort of brain. That may well be something you completely reject, but it's probably informed how you've been taught or the kind of expectations that the world has of you. So I think the idea of free to choose, I'd really like to challenge that in terms of what it is that you're being asked to choose.
So is it the force of the gender stereotypes that are still at work? They actually have a greater influence in those societies because people are freer to choose because they're under less pressure. Is that your argument?
That's part of it. And I think it's also the case that we're looking at, for example, this university level entry, I think. So, but if you're looking at 6-year-old girls, there was a really interesting study done by Sarah Jane Leslie and team, where 6-year-old girls don't choose a game that's described for really, really clever people. So we're looking at a life of low expectation, if you like. So, and by 9, girls are saying maths is for boys. I'm not going to choose maths, even though their performance is exactly the same, if not better than boys. So yes, but I think all of those factors, again, as with all of my arguments, so those are the kind of things you need to take into account. So free to choose is a nice phrase, but what is it you're choosing and what are you bringing to that choice?
Okay, so last one before some closing thoughts. There are sex differences in the prevalence of psychiatric disorders. Yes. So, for example, men are more prone to neurodevelopmental disorders like intellectual disability, autism, and ADHD, whereas women are nearly twice as likely as men to be diagnosed with depression and anxiety disorders. And I believe you're an expert in particular in autism. How does your theory that there are no brain differences account for these differences in psychiatric disorders? Okay,
gosh. I mean, the autism thing is interesting because I believe that you are looking at brain differences there, and that's what my research has been showing, that there are differences in individuals on the spectrum which directly affect how the world affects them and how they interact with the world, including understanding social rules. So I think, yes, there are differences in that, in a way characterises the fact that how a different brain can lead to different behaviours. Autism is interesting because it's conveyed as a male disorder, and yet it's become a hot topic within autism because there's now a realisation that actually there's huge numbers of women who are clearly on the spectrum, girls and women on the spectrum, who haven't been diagnosed or identified because there is this filter, this expectation that autism is a male problem. So if a girl presents with behavioural problem, and parents will attest to this, it takes years for somebody to say, do you know what, she could actually be on the spectrum, and then is identified. And so, of course, they've been given all sorts of other explanations. It presents differently in girls, they say, so girls make eye contact, so can't possibly be autistic, kind of thing. And anyway, she's a girl and autism is a boy problem. So that's quite a nice case study. I think there are neurodevelopmental disorders which do arise from very clear brain dysfunction. What's interesting about the disorders where there's a higher incidence of females is that they are what you could call biosocial disorders, depression, disorders of self-esteem, disorders of self-image, eating disorders, self-harm. They emerge at adolescence. They're not lifelong disorders like autism and ADHD and etc. So I think they, again, make a very interesting case study to say, what could the world be doing to this brain, which may be more susceptible, which is resulting in these individuals having much higher levels of depression. And I mean, I think I talk in the book about a huge study done on levels of self-esteem. And in every single country in the world, women have lower levels of self-esteem. And I think that would be really interesting to look at as a neuroscientist. Topic of my next book.
Really? Okay. You've got the scoop here.
Okay, you didn't hear it from me.
So do you want to leave us with some closing thoughts? You've mentioned that you have been part of a campaign to improve the representation of women in STEM subjects. What are the repercussions of your ideas? What are the sort of social and political issues that we should be facing as a result of these or as a consequence?
Okay. Well, I think the optimistic message is that if a lot of the differences we're seeing come from society, from social pressures, that's something we can do something about. And sometimes it's just information, making parents careful about the kind of toys they make available is not just a kind of PC, eye-rolling, whatever. It's important. And I think telling them that, and they respond. I mean, parents generally, do want to know what's best for their children. And so somebody coming along and saying, yes, don't stop them playing with Barbie if that's what they want to do, but make sure they also have some construction toys, and teachers not praising girls differently from boys. A wonderful phrase about we raise our boys to be brave and our girls to be perfect. Just aware of that, it can change behaviour. And I think what we now know, and that's the good news about our plastic brain, is that will have an impact. So I think it's a positive message, hopefully. And I think people being aware of that. The science issue, I think science needs to look at itself really carefully in terms of its culture, in terms of its support for the social context in which people function, as well as just being a closed lab which produces stuff. I think that's important, and science is responding to it, and I think that's good. So we can make a difference to brains.
Well, Gina, thank you. It's been a very stimulating discussion.
Cheers. Thank you.